The smoke from our winter camp was still rising when I crawled out from under the body of my husband. I do not remember the sound the soldiers made as they rode away. I remember only the silence after, and the way the snow on the eastern ridge had turned pink, and the way my youngest daughter was crying without making any noise at all, the way a child cries when she has already learned that crying brings men with rifles. My name does not matter to this telling. The white men in the towns I would walk to could not say it, and the man who finally opened his door to me did not ask it for a long time. What matters is that I was 26 years old on the morning the 6th Cavalry came down off the Mogollon Rim into our camp at first light. And by the time the sun was full up, I was a widow, and my brothers were dead, and my mother was dead, and the only living things left of my world were the 2 small girls who had hidden under a fallen lodgepole with a buffalo robe pulled over their heads while the men of my band died trying to buy them another minute of breath. My husband had told them to hide. He had pushed them down into the cold ash of the cooking fire and pulled the robe over them and said in our language, "Do not move, do not breathe, do not come out until the mother comes for you." And then he had gone out with his old trade rifle and his good knife, and he had not come back. I found him at the edge of the camp where the lodge poles ended and the open ground began. He was on his back. His eyes were open and looking up past the smoke at the morning sky. There was a bullet hole through the middle of him and another through his throat, and his hand was still curled around the rifle stock as if he had been about to fire one more time. I knelt down beside him in the trampled snow, and I put my forehead against his forehead, and I did not weep, because the soldiers were perhaps not yet over the ridge, and a woman who weeps cannot listen for hoofbeats. I closed his eyes with my fingers. I took his good knife from his belt, and I put it inside my own belt under the woven sash. I took the small leather pouch from his neck that held the marriage stone he had given me on the day we walked out of my father's lodge together, and I put that around my own neck. And then I went back through the burning lodges, stepping over my brother and my mother and a cousin whose face I could no longer recognize. And I crawled under the fallen pole where the buffalo robe was still pulled over my daughters, and I lifted the robe. The 5-year-old looked up at me. Her face was streaked with ash, and her 2 thin braids were undone on one side, and her dark eyes were already too old. She did not say anything. She just looked at me, waiting for me to tell her what was true. I have thought a great many times about that look. I have thought that it was the moment her childhood ended, and that no kindness any man could ever give her would put it back, but that some kindnesses come close. The 3-year-old was asleep. She had cried herself unconscious under the robe, the way very small children will when there is nothing left in them. Her cheeks were sticky with tears, and her thumb was in her mouth, and her free hand was curled in her sister's dress. I picked her up, and she did not wake. I held out my other hand to my older girl, and she took it, and she crawled out from under the lodge pole, and she stood up, and she looked once around our camp, and she did not look again. I will tell you what we took. I took my husband's knife, and the marriage stone, and the wool blanket I had been wearing when the first shot was fired, and a small leather satchel that had a fire striker in it, and a piece of jerked venison and a tin cup. I took a folded square of soft deer hide that I had been planning to make into moccasins for the youngest. I took the older girl's small carved wooden horse that her uncle had whittled for her last summer. I took the youngest girl in my arms, and I took the hand of the older girl in my free hand, and I walked out of the place that had been my home since the day I was born, and I did not look back, because if I had looked back, I would have lain down in the snow with my husband, and I would not have gotten up again, and the children would have died there, and the men of the 6th Cavalry would have won the whole of the morning. We walked east, because east was away from the soldiers, and east was where the white settlements were. And I had heard from a mescalero woman in the trading post the summer before that some of the white settlements had a thing called a church, and that the white god of the church was supposed to take in widows and the fatherless. I did not believe it was true. But I had 2 children, and I had no people left, and the snow was deep on the high passes, and I had to walk toward something, or I would walk toward nothing. The first day we walked 9 miles. I know it was 9 because I counted the ridges. The 5-year-old walked beside me without complaint. The 3-year-old slept in my arms or rode on my hip, or when my arms began to shake from the cold, walked a few steps and fell down and got up and walked a few more. By dusk, her small leather moccasins had worn through at the toes. I tore a strip from the bottom of my dress and bound her feet, and we slept that night in a hollow under a juniper, all 3 of us pressed together under the wool blanket, and the older girl whispered to me in the dark, "Mother, where are we going?" And I said, "To the white settlement." And she said, "Why?" And I said, "Because they have bread." And she did not ask anything else, because she was 5 years old and she trusted me. And that was the worst thing of all. The second day we walked because we had to. The third day we walked because we had begun to walk, and there was no stopping. The fourth day my milk dried up entirely, and the youngest cried for it in her sleep, and I could do nothing but hold her tighter and hum the lullaby my mother had hummed to me, the one about the mountain that loves the river and the river that loves the sea. On the 5th day we found a frozen creek, and I broke the ice with the butt of my husband's knife, and we drank, and I caught a small trout with my bare hands in a shallow pool, and we ate it raw because I was afraid to make a fire. On the 6th day we passed the burned-out remains of a Navajo hogan, and I knew then that the soldiers had been busy that winter, and that we were not the only people walking. On the 7th day, a coyote followed us for half a mile, and the older girl was afraid of him, and I told her he was a brother, and she did not believe me, but she stopped crying. On the 8th day, the youngest could no longer walk at all, and I carried her, and the older girl carried the small leather satchel and the wooden horse, and I felt the weight of all 3 of us in my legs, and I knew I had perhaps 2 more days of walking left in my body before my body refused. On the 9th day, near sundown, we came down out of the high country into a long valley with a frozen river in it, and at the far end of the valley there was a column of pale wood smoke, and the older girl saw it first, and she pointed, and she said in our language, "Mother, fire." And I said, "Yes, daughter, fire," and we walked toward it. The settlement was called Pinos Altos. I learned the name later. That night I did not know its name. I knew only that there were houses with glass in the windows and yellow lamplight inside the glass, and a road of frozen mud running between them, and a steeple with a cross on it at the far end of the road, and people moving inside the windows like fish moving inside ponds. I stopped at the edge of the settlement, and I knelt down in the snow with my daughters, and I wiped their faces with the corner of my blanket, and I retied the older girl's braids with shaking fingers. I wanted them to look like daughters, not like ghosts. I wanted whoever opened the first door to see 2 small girls who had walked 9 days, and not 2 small Apache girls, because I knew already, in some place behind my ribs, that the difference would matter. The first door I went to was the church. It was painted white. I remember that very clearly. It was painted white, and the paint was fresh, and it gleamed even in the failing light, and the cross on the steeple was iron, and there was a bell rope hanging beside the door, and there was lamplight inside the colored glass of the small windows. I could hear singing. The singing was in English, and I did not understand the words, but I understood the shape of it, the way voices rise together when people are asking something of a god. And I thought, perhaps this is the place the mescalero woman meant. Perhaps the god inside this house takes in widows. I knocked. I knocked with my knuckles 3 times, because that is how my husband had told me white people knock. I waited. The singing stopped. Footsteps came to the door. The door opened. A man stood in the doorway in a black coat with a white collar, and his face was thin and his eyes were pale. And behind him, I could see a room full of white men and white women in their best clothes, sitting in rows on benches, and a fire in a stove, and a wooden box at the front with a book on it. The man in the black coat looked at me. He looked at my daughters. His eyes went over the wool blanket and the woven sash and the leather moccasins and the dark cast of our skin, and I saw his face change. It did not become cruel. It became something worse than cruel. It became blank. He put his hand on the edge of the door and he said something in English, and he said it twice, and the second time his voice was harder, and I did not understand the words, but I understood very clearly what he was saying. He was saying, "This house is not for you." Then he closed the door. I stood there a long moment with my hand still half raised toward the wood. I could hear the singing start again behind the closed door. The youngest in my arms made a small whimpering sound and pressed her face against my neck. The older girl stood very still beside me and did not say anything. I lowered my hand. I turned. I walked back down the steps of the white-painted church and into the road of frozen mud, and I did not weep, because if I had wept, the older girl would have seen me weep, and a child who sees her mother weep at a closed door learns something that cannot be unlearned. The second door I went to was the schoolhouse. It was at the other end of the settlement, a low building of squared logs with a small bell on a post and a wooden sign nailed above the door that I could not read. There was lamplight in the windows, and I could see a woman inside, a young woman with her hair pinned up, sweeping the floor. I knocked. She came to the door. She had a kind face. I remember thinking she had a kind face, and that perhaps a kind face would mean something. She opened the door, and the warm air came out of the schoolhouse, and I felt it on my face, and I almost cried at the goodness of warm air. And I held out the older girl's hand toward her, and I said, in the few English words I had, I said, "Please, child, food, please." She looked at me. She looked at the older girl. Her kind face stayed kind for one moment longer, and then it was as if someone had drawn a curtain behind her eyes, and the kindness was still there, but it was on the other side of the curtain, and it could not reach us. She said something gentle. She said it slowly, as if I were a child. She shook her head. She said, "No, no, no." She closed the door, and I heard the bolt slide on the inside. The third door was the boarding house. The woman who opened it had a broom in her hand, and she did not even let me speak. She used the broom. She swept at my daughter's feet as if we were dogs, and she said words I did not need to understand. and I picked up the older girl in my free arm, and I backed away from the broom, and I went down the porch steps 2 at a time. And the broom followed us out into the road, and a man on the porch of the saloon laughed at her and at us, and I did not look at him. The 4th door was the mercantile. The man inside was counting coins on a long wooden counter, and he looked up when I came in, and he looked back down at the coins, and he said, without looking at me, "You people don't trade here." I did not know what trade meant. I held out my husband's knife to him, because it was the only thing of value I had, and I pointed at a loaf of bread on a shelf behind him, and he looked up at the knife in my hand, and his face went still, and he reached under the counter, and I saw the shape of what he was reaching for, and I turned and I took my daughters, and I walked out of the mercantile, and the small bell on the door rang behind us, and the older girl said, "Mother, why?" And I said, "Daughter, I do not know." The 5th door was a house at the edge of the settlement, a small house with a yellow lamp in the window and the smell of stew coming out of the chimney. A woman opened it. She was perhaps 60 years old. She had gray hair and a soft chin. She looked at us, and her eyes filled, and for one moment I thought, this one will say yes. And then her husband came up behind her in the doorway, a tall man with a gray mustache, and he said something to her in a low voice, and her eyes did not change, but her hand on the door changed, and she said, in slow English, I am sorry, child, I am sorry," and she closed the door, and I heard her crying on the other side of it as we walked away, and I did not know which was worse, the priest who had no feeling, or the woman who had feeling and could not use it. I will not tell you about the other doors. There were 2 more in the settlement, and one at a farmhouse 3 miles up the valley, and one at a sheep camp where the dogs came out at us, and I had to swing the wool blanket at them to keep them off the children. I will tell you only that by the time the moon was up over the ridges, I had knocked on every door I could find, and not one of them had opened to us, and the youngest was no longer crying, which was worse than crying, and the older girl was walking with her eyes half closed, and I was beginning to understand that I had been wrong, that the mescalero woman had been wrong, that the white God of the church did not take in widows like me, and that we were going to die in the snow at the edge of someone else's road. We slept that night in the lee of a haystack outside the settlement. I dug a hole into the hay and pushed the children into it and crawled in after them and pulled the blanket over the 3 of us, and I held them against me, and I told them stories in our language until they slept. I told the story of the mountain that loves the river. I told the story of the woman who married the bear. I told the story of the child who was raised by an eagle, and I made the eagle in my story a kind eagle, because I needed her to be, and because the older girl was listening and counting on me to make the world bearable for one more night. In the morning I got up before the sun, and I shook the hay out of my daughter's hair, and I tied the strips of dress more tightly around the youngest's feet, and I picked her up, and I took the older girl's hand, and we walked out of that valley, and we walked up into the high pine country, because there was nowhere left to go in the settlements of men, and I had decided, in the dark of that night under the haystack, that if we were going to die, we were going to die in the trees, where my mother's mother had been born, and not in the road of a town that had 7 doors closed against us. We walked all of the 10th day. The pines closed in around us. The snow was deeper here, and the air was thinner, and the youngest fell asleep on my shoulder, and I could feel her breath against my neck, and I could feel that her breath was getting slower and shallower, and I knew the way a mother knows that she was no longer fighting. I walked faster. I did not know what I was walking toward. I was simply walking, because to stop was to confess. At dusk, on the 10th day, we came up over a small rise in the pines, and on the other side of the rise there was a clearing, and in the clearing there was a cabin. It was small. It was made of hand-notched logs, dark with age, with a steep shake roof and a stone chimney and a single small glass window beside the door. A horse was tied to a rail at one side. Smoke was rising from the chimney. There was a man in the clearing in front of the cabin, and he was splitting wood. He was bare to the waist. I will tell you he was bare to the waist because that is what I saw, and because in the years that came I would learn that he was always bare to the waist when he worked, no matter the weather, because the cold did not seem to find him the way it found other men. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with the long, hard muscles of a man who has worked alone in the mountains for a long time. There was a long scar that ran in a deep diagonal down from the place where his neck met his right shoulder. A scar I would learn later had been made by a Confederate saber at a place called Yellow Tavern when he was 19 years old. His hair was dark and long, and tied at the back of his neck with a leather cord, and his beard was full and dark, and his skin was deeply tanned where the sun had reached it, and his eyes, when he looked up, were the pale, steady blue of the high winter sky. He was bringing the axe down on a piece of pine when I came over the rise. The axe stopped halfway through its arc. He saw us. He did not move for a long moment. He looked at me and at the youngest in my arms and at the older girl beside me, and his eyes went down to the older girl's feet, and I saw his eyes change, and I followed his look, and I saw what he was seeing, that the strips I had tied around her feet had worn through, and that her bare small toes were bleeding on the pine needles, and that there was a thin trail of blood behind her on the snow between the trees. He let the axe fall. He did not throw it down. He let it down slowly, with care, the way a man lays down a tool he respects. And he leaned the handle against the chopping block, and he straightened up, and he walked across the clearing toward us. I did not move. I could not have moved. I had walked 9 days through the high desert and the high pine country, and I had been turned away from 7 doors, and I had nothing left in my legs and nothing left in my arms, and the youngest was hanging against my shoulder like wet cloth, and the older girl had pressed herself against my hip, and I stood there in the snow at the edge of the clearing, and I waited, because there was nothing else to do. He did not come all the way to us. He stopped perhaps 10 paces off, where I could see his face clearly, and where the older girl could see it too. He looked at me. He looked at the children. He did not speak. He did not ask. He did not put his hand out toward us, or reach toward the older girl's hair the way men sometimes do with strange children. He simply turned after a long moment, and he walked to the cabin door, and he opened it, and he stood beside the open door, and he gestured with one open palm into the warm dark of the cabin. That was all. That was the whole of it. He did not say a word. He opened the door and he gestured us inside, and he never asked why. I stood at the edge of the clearing for what felt like a long time. The older girl looked up at me. I could feel her hand small and cold inside mine. The youngest did not move on my shoulder. The man at the cabin door waited. He did not call to us. He did not beckon a second time. He simply held the door open with his left hand resting on the door frame and his hat in his right hand, and his pale blue eyes steady on mine across the snow. And I understood in that moment that he had decided, all at once and without asking himself anything, that we were going to come inside, and that he was going to wait there as long as it took. I took a step. The older girl took a step with me. We walked across the clearing toward the cabin. The man at the door did not move. When we reached the threshold, he stepped aside to let us pass, and as I went by him, I smelled wood smoke and pine pitch and the sharp, clean smell of a man who has been working in cold air. And I felt the warmth of the cabin come out and meet me on my face, and I almost fell. He saw me sway. He put his hand under my elbow. It was the first time a man not of my people had touched me with kindness. And I will tell you that his hand was warm and broad and steady, and that he did not grip me, only held me up, and that he moved his hand away the moment I had my balance back. He did not touch the children at all. He stood aside and he let me carry them in. He shut the door behind us. The cabin was one room. I will tell you what I saw, because I have not forgotten it. There was a stone hearth with a low fire and an iron kettle on a hook over the fire. There was a hand-hewn table with one bench. There was a narrow bed in the corner with a thick wool quilt folded at the foot. There was a shelf above the hearth with a tin lamp and a small leather-bound book and a rack of hooks where a heavy coat and a powder horn and a long flintlock rifle hung. There was a single small window beside the door with a square of clean glass in it. There was a planked floor swept clean and a braided rag rug in front of the hearth, and the rug was the only soft thing in the room, and the older girl looked at it as if it were a miracle. He did not speak. He went to the hearth and he hung his hat on a peg, and he put another log on the fire, and the fire jumped up, and the room got brighter. He took the iron kettle off the hook. He poured hot water from the kettle into a tin basin, and he set the basin on the floor in front of the rug. And he took a clean cloth from a peg and laid it beside the basin, and he stepped back, and he gestured at the basin, and I understood that he was offering it to me to wash the children's feet. I knelt down on the rug. I put the youngest down beside me, and she did not wake. I took the older girl's small, bleeding feet in my hands, and I unwrapped the rags, and the rags came away with skin in them, and the older girl bit the inside of her cheek and did not cry, and I dipped the cloth in the warm water, and I began to wash her feet, and the man stood at the hearth with his back turned to give us privacy, and he busied himself with the fire and the kettle as if he had not been watching. But I knew he had been watching, because when I was done washing the older girl's feet, I looked up and he was already holding out a small clay pot of what smelled like pine pitch salve. And he set it down on the rug beside me, and he stepped back again. I rubbed the salve into the older girl's torn feet. He took a strip of clean linen from a chest by the bed, and he laid it next to me, and I bound her feet, and then I did the same for the youngest, who woke for one moment when the warm water touched her foot and made a small sound, and then sank back against my chest and slept again. And the man stood at the hearth and watched the fire and did not look at us. And I will tell you that not looking at us in that moment was the kindest thing he could have done. When I was finished, he came over to the hearth, and he took down a loaf of dark bread from the shelf, and he tore it into 3 pieces. He gave one piece to the older girl. She took it in both hands. She looked at it for a long moment, the way a person looks at a thing they have stopped believing in, and then she ate it, slowly, in small bites. the way a child eats who has learned not to trust food. He gave one piece to me. He set the third piece aside on a clean cloth on the table for the youngest, for when she woke, he did not eat. He poured a cup of water from a stoneware pitcher, and he set it on the rug beside me. And then he went to the chest at the foot of the bed, and he opened it, and he took out the thick wool quilt I had seen folded there, and he carried it across the room, and he laid it over the youngest where she slept against my hip, and he tucked the corner of it gently under her chin, and his hand was very large and very careful, and he straightened up, and he stepped back, and he did not say a word. I will tell you what I did then. I sat on the rug in front of the hearth in the warm yellow light of the fire of a stranger's cabin, with my older daughter beside me chewing slowly on a piece of dark bread, and my younger daughter asleep against my hip, under a wool quilt that had been folded for someone else, and a man I had never seen before standing at the far side of the room with his back turned to give us our privacy, and I put my face down into my hands. And for the first time since the smoke had risen from our winter camp 10 days before, I wept. I wept without sound because the youngest was sleeping. I wept until the front of my dress was wet with it, and I wept until my shoulders shook. And the older girl saw me weeping, and she did not say anything. She only put her small hand on my back, and we sat there like that for a long time, and the man at the far side of the room never turned, and never spoke, and never moved, and the fire snapped in the hearth, and outside the small glass window the snow began to fall. He slept on the porch that first night. I did not understand it at first. When the youngest had woken and eaten her bread and drunk a little broth from a tin cup, and when the older girl was sleeping, curled against the youngest under the wool quilt on the narrow bed in the corner, the man took his heavy coat down from the peg by the door, and he took a folded buffalo robe from a chest under the bed, and he carried them outside, and I heard him lay them down on the planks of the porch. He came back in once to set another log on the fire, and he glanced at me where I sat on the bench beside the bed, and he nodded once, and he went back out, and he closed the door, and I heard him settle himself on the porch on the far side of the door, and I understood. He had given us the cabin. He was sleeping outside in the snow so that we would not be afraid. I sat on the bench beside the bed for a long time with my hand on the older girl's back, and I listened to the breathing of my children, and I listened to the small sounds of the man on the porch, the creak of him shifting his shoulders, the soft rasp of him drawing the buffalo robe up to his chin, and I listened to the snow falling on the shake roof. And I thought about the priest at the white-painted church, and I thought about the woman with the broom, and I thought about the man at the mercantile reaching under the counter, and I thought about the woman who had cried on the other side of her closed door, and then I thought about this man on this porch in the snow, and I did not know what to do with any of it. I lay down at the foot of the bed, on the floor, with my husband's knife under my hand. Because old habits do not die in a single night, and I closed my eyes, and I slept the sleep of a woman who has at last set down a thing she could not carry one more step, and outside, on the porch, the man who had opened his door slept too, and the snow fell on the both of us, and the fire burned low in the hearth. And that was the first night. He slept on the porch the second night, and the third, and the fourth. He slept on the porch for 10 nights, and on the 11th night the youngest woke crying for him from a dream in our language, and the older girl ran to the door and opened it and called him in, and after that He slept on the floor by the hearth on a pallet of buffalo robes, and the bed in the corner was ours, and the cabin was ours, and the man was ours, and we were his, and none of us had said any of it out loud, and none of us would for a long time. I will tell you about the months that came after the 10th night, because they were the years that gave me back to myself, and I do not want to leave them out. The first thing I learned was that he had food. He had a smokehouse out behind the cabin with elk and venison and trout hung in it. And he had a root cellar with potatoes and turnips and dried apples. And he had sacks of cornmeal and dried beans and coffee in a tin. And he had a milk goat tied behind the cabin who gave a thin, sweet milk in the mornings. And he had a hen and 3 pullets in a small coop. And he had a barrel of apples buried in straw. And he had, at the back of the cabin, a small sealed crock of honey he had taken from a wild hive in the autumn. He had not been hungry in a long time, and after the first week we were not hungry either, and the youngest cheeks began to fill back out, and the older girl's eyes began to lose the look they had carried out of the winter camp, and I saw that color again in her face. The warm brown the women of my mother's people called the color of cedar bark, and I knew she was going to live. The second thing I learned was that he was not a talking man. He went whole days without speaking. In the mornings he would build up the fire and put the kettle on and go out to the smokehouse and the goat shed and the wood pile, and I would hear him chopping or splitting or sawing, and he would come back in at midday for a bowl of stew at the table, and he would eat with us in silence. And he would nod once to the older girl when she passed him the salt, and he would go back out, and he would come in at dusk, and he would sit on the bench by the hearth and read the small leather-bound book that he kept on the shelf, which I learned later was a book of Psalms, and he would say his good night with a nod, and he would lie down on his pallet of buffalo robes by the hearth, and he would sleep. But he was not a silent man either. There is a difference, and it took me some weeks to learn it. A silent man is a man who is keeping things from you. This man was a quiet man. He was a man who had decided somewhere in his life that words were a thing to use carefully, the way you use a good knife, and that most of what mattered between people did not need them. He hummed when he split wood. He whistled, low and steady, when he was working with the goat. He laughed once at the youngest, when she fell sitting down in a snowdrift and looked up at him with an expression of such Apache widow indignation that he could not help it. The laugh came up out of him, slow and surprised, like a thing he had not used in a long time, and the older girl looked at him in astonishment, because she had not heard a man laugh in many months. And after that, I think the older girl began to love him in the careful way that a 5-year-old who has lost a father will let herself love a new man. The third thing I learned was that he was learning our language. I did not see it at first. He would say a word in the evenings by the fire, looking at a thing in the room, the kettle, the loaf, the rug, the door, and he would say the English word for it, slowly, and the older girl would say it back to him in English, and then she would say it in our language, and he would say it back to her in our language, slowly with great care, and he would nod, and he would set the word in a place inside himself where I could see he was keeping it. He never wrote any of it down. He kept it all in his head. Within the second month, he could say bread and water and fire and wood and warm and cold and pine and snow and door and bed and cup and quilt and hand and foot and good and tired and stay and go and please and thank you in our language. And he could say them well enough that the older girl no longer corrected him, and the older girl was a strict teacher. In return, I was learning English. I learned it slowly. I learned it from the leather book and from the man and from the older girl who picked it up faster than I did and corrected me without mercy. I learned to say good morning. I learned to say thank you. I learned to say cold and warm and bread and door. And one evening in the 3rd month, when the man was sitting on the bench by the hearth and reading his book of Psalms, and the youngest was asleep, and the older girl was carving small marks into a piece of pine with her uncle's knife, I sat down across from him at the table, and I waited for him to look up. And when he looked up, I said, in the careful English I had been practicing all week, "What is your name?" He set the book down on the bench. He did not answer at once. He looked at me for a long moment with his pale, steady blue eyes, and then he said, slowly, "My name is Caleb." And then he said, after another moment, "What is yours?" I told him. He said it back to me. He said it correctly. I had not thought he would be able to say it correctly. He said it as if he had been holding it in his mouth for a long time, waiting for me to give it to him. And then he picked up his book again, and he went back to reading, and we did not speak again that night. But a thing had happened, and we both knew a thing had happened, and the older girl, who had been pretending to carve her piece of pine, had been listening to the whole of it. And that night, when I tucked her into the bed beside her sister, she said to me in our language, "Mother, his name is Caleb." And I said, "Yes, daughter, his name is Caleb." And she said, "Mother, what is the word for him?" And I said, "Daughter, I do not yet know what is the word for him, and I will tell you when I know." There were small things in those months. I want to set them down because they were the bones of how we became a household, and a person who has not lived in a household built out of strangers will not know how the bones are laid. I will tell you the bones now. He never came near me at night. Not in the 1st month, not in the 2nd, not in the 3rd. He slept on his pallet of buffalo robes in front of the hearth, and I slept in the bed in the corner with the children. And when he had to walk past the bed in the dark to put another log on the fire, he walked past it as if it were a wall, and he did not look at it, and he did not pause beside it, and he did not breathe differently as he passed. I noticed all of this. A woman who has been a widow for 10 days notices everything a man does not do. He did not ask me about the camp. He did not ask me about my husband. He did not ask me about my brothers or my mother or the cousin whose face I could no longer recognize. He did not ask me where I had walked from or which band I had been born into or whether I knew the names of the soldiers who had come down off the rim. He did not ask me anything, ever, about the things that had brought me to his door. I understood, after some weeks, that this was not because he was incurious. He was a watching man, and a watching man is always curious. He did not ask because he had decided, in the first long moment when he had seen us at the edge of the clearing, that the answers were mine to give if I ever wanted to give them, and that until I did, the asking would be a small kind of taking, and he was not a taking man. He brought small things back from his trips. He went down off the mountain twice in the first 3 months, once to a Mormon farmstead 2 valleys over, once to a Hispano Packers camp on the old Spanish trace. And each time he came back with a thing that had not been in the cabin before. The first time he came back with a small wooden comb of cherry wood with fine teeth, and he set it on the bench beside me without a word. And I knew, in the way I had begun to know things about him, that he had seen me trying to comb the older girl's hair with my fingers, and had decided that a comb was a thing the cabin needed, and had walked 12 miles in the cold to get one. The second time he came back with a small folded square of indigo-dyed wool, and he set it down beside the youngest, where she sat on the rug, and the youngest looked at it for a long moment, and then she picked it up and pressed it against her cheek and went to sleep with it in her hand, and she would not be parted from it for the next 2 years. He let the older girl follow him. From the second week onward, she went out behind him in the mornings to the smokehouse and the woodpile and the goat shed in her small leather moccasins and her faded cotton dress and her thin braids. And she did not say a word, and he did not say a word, and they would come back inside together for the midday stew with their cheeks red from the cold and a kind of quiet understanding between them that had not been built out of any conversation I had heard. He let her hold the splitting wedge for him while he swung the maul. He let her carry the wooden water bucket back from the spring, two-handed, struggling, never offering to take it from her. He let her be useful. I think now that this was the medicine she had needed most. The priest at the white-painted church had looked at her and seen a problem. The man at the cabin had looked at her and seen a person who could carry a wooden water bucket. The difference between those two ways of looking is the difference between a child who shrinks and a child who grows. And I watched her grow that winter, day by day, hour by hour, and I will not forget who did the looking that let her do the growing. He kept his rifle clean. Every Sunday afternoon, in the slanted yellow light from the small glass window, he sat on the bench at the table, and he took the long flintlock down from its pegs above the door, and he laid it across a piece of soft deer hide on the table, and he took it apart, and he wiped each piece with an oiled rag, and he put it back together. The older girl watched him do this in silence for the first 3 Sundays. On the 4th Sunday, she sat down across from him at the table without asking, and he glanced up at her once, and he nodded, and he handed her the small ramrod and the oiled rag, and he showed her, slowly, how to clean the inside of the barrel, and she did it with great seriousness. Her tongue caught at the corner of her mouth, and from that Sunday on the cleaning of the rifle was a thing they did together, and I sat by the hearth and watched them, and I thought about my husband, who had cleaned his trade rifle on Sunday afternoons too, and who had taught the older girl to hold the ramrod when she was 3 years old. And I thought, the older girl is being given back a Sunday afternoon she had lost, and the man does not know he is doing it. And that is the best kind of giving, the kind that is done without knowing. He fed the youngest from his own plate. From the first week, he would tear off a small piece of meat from his portion of stew, and he would set it on the edge of the table in front of her, and she would reach for it and put it in her mouth, and he would tear off another piece and another, and by the end of the meal, his own bowl would be half empty, and the youngest's belly would be tight and round, and he would rinse his bowl at the basin without saying anything. And the youngest would crawl onto the rug in front of the hearth and fall asleep with a piece of meat still in her fist. I watched this for 2 weeks before I understood what he was doing. He was not feeding her because she was hungry. The cabin had food. He was feeding her because feeding her was teaching her that food came from him, and that food coming from him was a safe thing, and that a man's hand reaching toward her face was a hand bringing meat, and not a hand bringing harm. He was unteaching the soldiers, one piece of meat at a time. By the end of the 2nd month, she was reaching her own small hand out for his face when he came in from the cold, and patting his beard and saying in our language, "Here, here," and he was bending down to let her do it, and he did not flinch, ever. And the youngest learned in those weeks that a man could bend down toward her and not break her. And I do not know how to thank a man for unteaching a thing like that. And I have never tried to thank him, because thanking would be a smaller word than the thing he did. There were nights I could not sleep. I lay awake in the dark, in the bed, in the corner, with the children breathing on either side of me. And I listened to the small sounds of the cabin, the snap of the fire settling, the creak of a log in the cold, the soft shuffle of him turning on his pallet. And I thought about the burning lodge poles, and I thought about my husband's open eyes, and I thought about the bullet hole through his throat, and I shook, sometimes, very quietly, so as not to wake the girls. He never came to me on those nights. He never spoke. He never rose from his pallet to ask if I needed anything. But once, in the worst of those nights, when I had been shaking for a long time, I heard him add a log to the fire, and I heard him pour a cup of warm broth from the kettle, and I heard him set the cup down on the floor beside the bed, very softly, where I could find it without sitting up, and I heard him go back to his pallet and lie down again, and I drank the broth in the dark, and I went to sleep, and we never spoke of it, not the next morning, not ever. And that was how he was about everything that mattered. By the 4th month, the snow was beginning to soften on the south slopes, and the older girl was running in the clearing in the afternoons in a pair of small leather moccasins he had cut for her from a piece of his own deer hide. And the youngest was riding on his shoulders when he went out to the smokehouse, and he was teaching her the names of the trees in English while she pulled at his hair, and she was saying ponderosa and pinyon and juniper before she was saying her own name. And he had taught her to say please, and she said please all day long for everything, and he could deny her nothing, and the older girl was scornful of how easily he could be ruled by a 3-year-old, and he was scornful in return of how easily the older girl could be ruled by a wooden horse and a piece of honeycomb. And there was a kind of teasing between them, now that I had not heard between any people since the soldiers had come down off the rim. By the 5th month, I had begun to understand, in the slow way that a woman understands a thing she has not yet given herself permission to know, that I was not afraid of him. I had not been afraid of him since the 2nd night, perhaps, but I had not let myself name it, because to name a thing is to begin to need it, and I had decided in the haystack at the edge of Pinos Altos that I would never need a man again. But I had been wrong. I needed him. I did not need him the way a wife needs a husband. That would come later, in its own time, slowly, and I will not make a long thing of it here, because it was a small, slow, good thing, and not the thing this telling is about. I needed him the way a person needs the sun in winter, which is to say, simply, completely, without shame, and as a fact of being alive. By the 6th month, he was teaching the older girl to track elk. This is the picture of him I want to leave you with most clearly. It is a morning in early spring. The snow is gone from the south slope and lying still in patches on the north. The pines are dripping. The older girl is 5.5 years old now, and she is wearing a pair of small buckskin trousers he has cut for her from a hide, because she has decided, in the way of a 5-year-old, that she will be done with dresses, and he has agreed without arguing. She has her 2 thin black braids down her back and a small leather satchel on her shoulder that he has stitched for her, and in the satchel is a piece of jerked elk and a flint striker and a small whistle he has carved her from a piece of pine. He is walking ahead of her with his long flintlock rifle in the crook of his arm and his wide-brimmed brown leather hat on the back of his head, and no shirt on, because he never wears one except in the bitterest cold, and the long, deep diagonal scar on his right collarbone is plain in the morning light, and his pale blue eyes are reading the ground in a way I have come to recognize. He stops, he kneels, he puts his finger into the earth at the edge of a soft patch of needle duff, and he says, in our language, slowly, "Do you see, daughter?" The older girl kneels beside him. She looks. She says, in English, "The back hoof." He nods. He says, in English, "The back hoof comes down inside the front hoof." She says, in our language, "When?" He says, in English, "When the elk is afraid." She says, in our language, "Was this elk afraid?" He looks up the slope. He looks down the slope. He says, in our language, "No, daughter, this elk was only walking." And the older girl smiles, the small, careful smile she has begun to have around him in the last weeks. And they stand up, and they walk on, the man bare-chested and the daughter bare-headed, in the spring pines. And I am behind them with the youngest on my hip, and I watch them go, and I think, this is what my husband would have done if my husband had lived. And I think my husband did not live, and a different man is doing it, and the daughter is being taught, and the elk is being tracked, and the morning is being held, and I do not have the words for any of it in any language, and so I do not say anything, and I follow them up the slope. It is a year now since the morning the soldiers came down off the rim. The youngest is 4, and the older girl is 6, and the man we live with is 33, and I am 27, and the cabin has been added to. There is a second small room now, off the back, with a second small bed, and the older girl sleeps in it, alone and proud. And the youngest still sleeps in the main room, between me and the wall. And the man sleeps in the bed in the corner that used to be ours. And the bed in the corner is ours together now, mine and his. And I will say only that, and you may understand it as you wish. The older girl calls him father. She calls him father in English, and she calls him father in our language, the word my own daughters used for my husband, and she calls him father in the few words of Spanish she has picked up from a Mexican packer who passes through twice a year with the mail, and she does not see any contradiction in any of the three, and neither does he, and neither do I. The youngest calls him Caleb because she is 4, and she has decided his name is funny in her mouth, and he answers to it, and he carries her on his shoulders out to the smokehouse in the mornings, and he makes her say, "Please," and she says, "Please," and he gives her a piece of dried apple, and she eats it, sitting on his shoulders, and drops the peel into his beard, and he does not seem to mind. I will tell you the closing of this thing now, because the closing is short. Last night, after the children had gone to sleep, I sat on the porch with him in the cool spring evening, and he was whittling a small piece of pine, and I was darning a tear in the older girl's buckskin trousers, and the moon was coming up through the ponderosas, and the iron kettle was on the stove inside, and the cabin was quiet, and he said to me, in our language, slowly, the way he says everything in our language, "Are you cold?" And I said, in English, "No, I am not cold." And he nodded, and he went back to his whittling, and I went back to my darning, and after a long while I said to him, in English, slowly, "I want to tell you a thing." He did not look up. He said, "I am listening." I said, "The day you opened your door to me and to my daughters, the day you set down your axe and walked to the door and opened it and gestured us in, the day you never asked why, that day was the day I first knew, after the soldiers, that there were still good men left in the country that had killed my people. And I want you to know that I knew it, and I want you to know that I have not forgotten it, and I want you to know that I will never forget it. He set down his whittling. He looked at me. He looked at me for a long time with his pale, steady blue eyes, and the moon was on the long, deep, diagonal scar on his right collarbone, and his bare chest moved with his breathing, and he did not answer for so long that I thought perhaps he was not going to answer at all. Then he said, in our language, slowly, "I did not open the door because I am a good man. I opened the door because you were standing there." And then he said, in English, and your daughter's feet were bleeding. And then he said, in our language, "That is all there is." That was all there was. I have been writing this down by the lamp at the table tonight while he sleeps, because I do not want to lose any of it. And because the older girl is beginning to read English now, and one day she will read it, and one day she will read it to her sister, and one day perhaps she will read it to her own children. And I want them all to know that there was a country once that closed 7 doors against 3 walking women, and that beyond those 7 doors, up in the high pines near the Mogollon rim, on the 10th dusk, there was an 8th door, and it was the door of a quiet, broad-shouldered mountain man with a deep scar on his right collarbone and pale blue eyes and an axe in his hand. And that door opened, and he never asked why. And we walked in, and we never walked out again. That is the whole of the telling. That is what happened. That is what I want remembered. The fire is low. The man is asleep in the bed in the corner. The youngest is breathing softly against the wall. The older girl in the small back room is dreaming, I hope, of an elk that is only walking and not afraid. Outside the small glass window, the moon is up over the pines, and it is the same moon that was up over the burning lodge poles a year ago, and the same moon that was up over the haystack at the edge of Pinos Altos, and the same moon that was up over the snow on the 10th dusk when the man at the cabin door set down his axe. I am going to put down the pen now. I am going to put out the lamp. I am going to lie down beside him in the bed in the corner that used to be ours and is ours again. And I am going to sleep. And the country that killed my people will go on outside our door. And inside our door, there will be a fire and bread and a quilt for the youngest, and a pair of buckskin trousers for the older girl, and a man and a woman, and the 4 walls of a small 1-room hand-notched log cabin high in the pine forest near the Mogollon rim. And that, for tonight, and for as many tonights as we are given, will be enough. It will be enough. It is enough. It was enough on the first night, and it is enough on this night. And that is what I learned from the man who opened his door without asking why. There were still good men left in the country that had killed my people. There was at least one, and he was mine.